Every governor, judge, and senator who steps foot in the Mississippi State Capitol building walks on a floor that once ran slick with blood and echoed with the agonizing screams of children. This is not a tale about a spectral figure haunting a hallway. It is a true story about a forgotten structure, a monstrous system of human enslavement, and the chilling account of a young boy named Pepi, whose testimony brought a forgotten atrocity to light decades after the last nail was driven into a coffin. To understand the terror, we must first locate the epicenter of this hidden American tragedy, Natchez, Mississippi, in the early 1830s. The invisible city of Natchez-Under-the-Hill. For the American audience today, Natchez is synonymous with sweeping antebellum mansions, Spanish moss, and the gentility of the Old South. But below this city of grace lay a second, darker Natchez, Natchez-Under-the-Hill. This was not a quaint riverside landing. It was the most dangerous, depraved, and lawless mile of land in 19th century America. Tucked beneath 200-foot bluffs and accessible primarily by a single, treacherous winding road, the Under-the-Hill district was the terminus of the infamous Natchez Trace, a winding, often deadly path that stretched 440 miles from Nashville. Fact, the famed trace was the highway of the future and the graveyard of the past. Flatboats and barges carrying cotton, tobacco, and whiskey floated down the Mississippi River to Natchez, but when their cargo was sold, the boatmen had to hike or ride the trace back home, a journey notorious for its highwaymen, murderers, and outlaws. Many never made it. This underbelly city was a hive of vice. 24/7 brothels, gambling dens, and saloons where the only rule was brute force. It was here, in 1834, that an enterprise unlike any other in the history of American slavery was booming, not in cotton fields, but in a horrific human trade, the business of fancy girls and human fodder. The forks of the road, a human stockyard. While New Orleans was the largest slave market in the United States, Natchez, specifically the Forks, was the largest slave depot. It was the logistical hub where hundreds of thousands of human beings were processed, traded, and driven further west into the burgeoning cotton kingdoms of Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas. Key data point. Historians estimate that between 1800 and 1860, over 300,000 enslaved people were moved through the Natchez district. That is nearly 3 times the number of total combat casualties suffered by the United States during the entire Civil War. This was an economic migration of forced labor unparalleled in the Western Hemisphere. The dealers at the Forks, men who made millions in today's dollars, were masters of industrialized cruelty. They purchased people in the Upper South, Virginia, Maryland, Kentucky, marched them hundreds of miles in chains, known as coffles, and held them in makeshift pens until a wealthy planter was ready to buy. And yet, this is still the preamble to the true horror. The sheer scale of the atrocity was known. What wasn't known was the identity of the most monstrous individuals and the dark secret of their hidden workshop of death. John Murrell and the Mystic Clan. In the fevered imagination of the 1830s, one name rose above all others as the boogeyman of the Southwest, John Murrell, the self-proclaimed Great Western land pirate. Murrell was a legend in his own time, a man rumored to command a vast criminal empire known as the Mystic Clan, or Murrell's Gang. His documented crimes were horrific enough: horse theft, counterfeiting, and the murder of countless travelers along the Natchez Trace. Murrell wasn't just a bandit. He was a sophisticated criminal mastermind who utilized the very chaos of the American frontier to hide his enterprises. The legend. The stories claimed Murrell had a network of 1,000 men, a complex system of signals, and a secret plan to incite a mass slave revolt across the South to cover up a colossal robbery. This legend, mostly exaggerated sensationalism, obscured a much smaller, more tangible, and more depraved truth: the Natchez Insane Asylum and the missing children. Now we must connect the depravity of the city's underbelly to the respectable governing class. In 1836, the state of Mississippi authorized the construction of a state-of-the-art lunatic asylum just outside the Natchez city limits. It was intended to be a beacon of enlightenment, a place for the mentally ill to be treated humanely, a departure from the cruelties of the past. But the cornerstone laid that year concealed a secret that would go undiscovered for a century. The building itself was architecturally complex, with vast deep cellars and numerous subterranean tunnels, a common feature in antebellum asylums designed for cooling and security. Local records of the period show a series of highly unusual and significant purchases made by the asylum's construction manager, a prominent local figure named William Lloyd, a man who was also rumored to have close financial ties to the Natchez-Under-the-Hill vice rings.
Unusual purchases. Lloyd ordered thousands of extra feet of wrought iron bars and a massive quantity of quicklime, far exceeding what would be necessary for a standard construction project. Quicklime was often used in latrines, but the sheer volume was baffling. The official story was that the asylum ran into financial difficulties and construction stalled indefinitely. For decades, the towering, half-finished edifice sat on the outskirts of Natchez, a silent, imposing stone skeleton, known locally as the House of Lost Souls. And then, people began to notice what was missing: the disappearances. In the late 1830s and early 1840s, a subtle but consistent trend began: the disappearance of enslaved children. These were not the runaways whose names filled newspaper ads. These were children, mostly boys between the ages of 8 and 14, who vanished without a trace, often from the homes of smaller, less wealthy planters, or from the docks of Natchez-Under-the-Hill. The disappearances were attributed to illness, accidents, or the complexity of the slave trade. No one connected the dots. The dots would not be connected until 1844, when John Murrell was finally captured and incarcerated in the Tennessee State Penitentiary. While the legend of the Mystic Clan had captivated the nation, the truth of Murrell's final, most appalling criminal enterprise was about to be revealed, not by Murrell himself, but by a ghost from his past, a runaway slave boy named Pepi. Pepi, an enslaved boy who had escaped his bondage in Mississippi and made his way north, was apprehended in Cincinnati, Ohio, under the Fugitive Slave Act. Facing the terrifying prospect of being returned south, Pepi made a desperate, calculated move. He offered information of monumental significance in exchange for his freedom. He confessed to a Cincinnati abolitionist society that he hadn't just been a runaway. He had been an unwilling apprentice to John Murrell for 4 years. Pepi's testimony, which was meticulously recorded by a notary and later published in part by abolitionist newspapers, described an operation far more grotesque than simple robbery. He described the asylum. Pepi explained that Murrell had formed an unholy partnership with William Lloyd, the respectable construction manager of the abandoned lunatic asylum. They used the complex, unfinished structure with its deep, reinforced cellars and isolated location as the headquarters for their final, most profitable crime: counterfeiting U.S. coinage and creating a human disposal site for their most dangerous witnesses. The workshop. Murrell and his small inner circle were minting counterfeit silver dollars in the subcellars of the asylum. The complex ironwork Lloyd had purchased was used to secure the minting press and to create soundproofing, masking the clanking of the machinery. The victims, the boys. Pepi's most shocking revelation was about the missing children. He described how Murrell would use the enslaved boys as lookouts, laborers, and sometimes, terrifyingly, as his personal messengers. But every few weeks, one of the boys would disappear. Pepi, hiding in the rafters of the dark cellar, saw the truth. He testified that Murrell, ever the calculating mind, realized that witnesses were his greatest liability. He could not simply free a boy who knew the location of his minting press, and selling them would be just as risky. So he devised a final solution. Pepi described the execution in harrowing detail. The boy would be taken to a small, isolated room off the main cellar, given a meal, and then murdered by a single sharp blow to the head with a hammer, delivered by Murrell himself. The bodies were then doused with the massive stock of quicklime Lloyd had procured and disposed of in an unmarked subterranean vault beneath the asylum's unbuilt central wing. Pepi, who had been spared because Murrell was still using him, knew that his time was limited. He fled the night after he saw his friend, a boy named Samson, executed for spilling a cup of coffee near the minting operation. The lost report and the weight of history. Pepi's testimony was a bombshell. It described a counterfeiting operation, an official conspiracy, and the serial murder of enslaved children on state-owned land. The abolitionists sent the notarized statement to Mississippi Governor Alexander G. McNutt, demanding an immediate investigation of the abandoned asylum. The governor's response? Silence. No police were sent, no warrants were issued for William Lloyd. The official reason was that Pepi, being a runaway slave, was an unreliable, non-credible witness whose testimony was likely fabricated to escape extradition. Unofficially, Governor McNutt was a fierce defender of states' rights and the institution of slavery, and the idea of digging up state property based on the word of a fugitive would have been political suicide and a catastrophic admission of failure. The report was filed away, discredited and forgotten. Pepi was granted his freedom, but his truth remained buried beneath the earth of Natchez. The asylum remained a ruin for a century. It became a local legend, a haunted place where children dared each other to trespass. The true horror was overlooked by local historians who dismissed the Murrell stories as tall tales. For nearly 100 years, Pepi's desperate account lay dormant in the archives of a Cincinnati anti-slavery society, a ghost story disguised as legal testimony. Natchez thrived, slowly shedding its dangerous under-the-hill reputation and embracing its image as a Southern architectural gem. The old, unfinished lunatic asylum remained untouched, eventually becoming an overgrown curiosity, a massive, silent monument to government inefficiency. Then, in the early 1930s, the structure was finally torn down. The land was deemed too valuable to sit idle. Mississippi decided to build a new modern state facility on the site, initially intended as an annex to the state prison system. As the demolition crews moved in, they systematically dismantled the thick stone walls and dug out the deep, foundational cellars Pepi had described. 1934 discovery. During the clearing of the deepest level of the central cellar, the area Pepi identified as the counterfeiting workshop, crews stumbled upon something unusual. A heavy wrought iron contraption clearly designed for securing a massive machine, bolted directly into the stone foundation. It was far too robust for typical asylum machinery. Next to it, they found evidence of unusual metal residue, consistent with early copper and silver smelting, the hallmark of a sophisticated minting operation. The local foreman, aware of the old Murrell legends, reported the findings, but without the context of Pepi's testimony, the artifacts were cataloged as unidentified mechanical parts and stored away. The focus was on construction, not archaeology. 1950, the governor's new home. The state's plans changed again. The site's elevated location and proximity to Natchez made it ideal for a more prominent structure. In 1950, construction began on the magnificent new Mississippi governor's mansion. The new mansion was designed to project wealth, power, and stability. The foundation work was extensive, requiring deep trenches and a thorough clearing of the remaining debris from the abandoned asylum. It was during the final phase of clearing the subgrade utilities, near where the old structure's side wing would have been, that a young civil engineer named Martin Thorne noticed a discrepancy. Thorne was reviewing the original 1836 blueprints of the asylum, which had been retrieved from state archives. He noticed that a small, isolated subterranean vault, a room never intended to connect to the main structure, was listed on the plans, but its purpose was marked ambiguously. More critically, the vault was situated directly beneath the spot where the governor's future formal reception garden was being laid out. Curiosity piqued, Thorne insisted on excavating the area. The construction manager initially resisted, citing time and budget, but Thorne's persistence, fueled by a growing suspicion that the site held more than just historical debris, prevailed. The Vault of Quicklime. What they unearthed was a site that stopped the massive construction project instantly. Breaking through a thick layer of tamped earth and concrete, the crews uncovered a small brick-lined pit. It was precisely where Pepi had said the bodies were buried. The pit contained a dense, compacted mixture of earth, stone, and an extraordinarily large concentration of calcium oxide, quicklime. Quicklime is a powerful desiccant that preserves bones while destroying soft tissue, turning the entire area into a grisly, petrified tomb. As Thorne and his team carefully sifted through the lime, the horrifying truth began to materialize. They found not one, but multiple small skeletons. The bones were highly fragmented due to the lime and the decades of pressure, but the medical examiner quickly confirmed the preliminary findings. Victims: at least 12 individual skeletons were recovered. Age: all remains belonged to children, primarily male, ranging from approximately 9 to 14 years old. Cause of death: forensic analysis of the fragile skulls revealed uniform, localized trauma, crushing fractures consistent with a single, blunt, powerful strike to the back of the head. This matched Pepi's description of Murrell's method of execution, a hammer blow. The governor's mansion construction site became a crime scene over a century old. The news was immediately suppressed by state officials, terrified of the public relations disaster of building the official residence on top of a mass grave of murdered children, especially in the racially charged atmosphere of the 1950s Deep South. Pepi's vindications. A historian connects the dots. The state's attempts to silence the discovery failed entirely due to the intervention of Professor Evelyn Hayes, a historian from the University of Mississippi, specializing in antebellum criminal networks. Hayes, who was already studying the John Murrell myth, was granted limited access to the site's original archival materials. She realized the official account that these were indigent children who died of cholera during the asylum's initial construction was a ludicrous cover-up. Thorne showed her the construction foreman's notes from 1934 about the wrought iron and the metallic residue. Hayes instantly connected the dots. The isolated and complex cellars of the asylum, the massive, unusual quantities of wrought iron and quicklime purchased by William Lloyd, the metallic residue consistent with counterfeiting, the dozen small bodies, all killed by the same method. Hayes realized the only missing piece of evidence was the original 1844 abolitionist testimony. Through relentless research, she tracked down the long-forgotten records in the Cincinnati Historical Society. There, she found Pepi. Pepi's notarized, detailed account perfectly matched the 1950 archaeological evidence. He named the site, described the cellar layout, identified the counterfeiting operation, named the accomplice, Lloyd, and most chillingly, described the murder weapon and the method of disposal in the quicklime pit. The forgotten testimony of an enslaved boy, dismissed as a lie for over 100 years, was proven to be the only completely accurate and verifiable document describing the Natchez Lunatic Asylum's true purpose. The truth on sacred ground. Professor Hayes's published findings, initially met with resistance and skepticism, eventually forced the state of Mississippi to acknowledge the horrific truth. The site of the magnificent governor's mansion was unequivocally the former operational headquarters of a serial counterfeiting and murder ring run by John Murrell and protected by local power figures like William Lloyd. The victims were not nameless indigents, but enslaved children silenced because they witnessed a financial crime. The implications for the American narrative of slavery and frontier justice were profound. 1. Challenging the narrative of the criminal outlaw. Murrell was not just a lone, mythical highwayman, he was a sophisticated killer who used the economic infrastructure of slavery, the ability to purchase, control, and dispose of human witnesses without police interference, to facilitate his most profitable crime, counterfeiting. 2. Highlighting the complicity of the system. William Lloyd, a respectable businessman, served as the indispensable accomplice, utilizing his official position and state funds to procure the necessary supplies, quicklime and iron, and secured the perfect, isolated location, state property. The failure of Governor McNutt to act on Pepi's credible testimony highlights how the legal and political system actively shielded the perpetrators and dismissed the lives of the victims. The story of the governor's mansion is not about a traditional haunting, it is about historical erasure. The most powerful symbol of the state's respectability, the governor's home, was built directly over the tangible evidence of its most heinous crime, literally burying the victim's truth under the official grounds of power.